When we think about the early history of Islam in the Indian subcontinent, our minds often go straight to the conquest of Sindh by Muhammad bin Qasim in 712 CE, that dramatic moment when Arab forces crossed the Indus River and changed the course of South Asian history forever. We remember the young general, the battles, the fall of Raja Dahir, and the rise of a new order under the Umayyad Caliphate. But after that first wave of conquest, something quieter, slower, yet deeply transformative began to unfold. It was not a story of armies or sieges, but a story of governance, culture, faith, and adaptation. It was the story of the Abbasid era in Sindh, a chapter often forgotten, overshadowed by the more dramatic tales of conquest and rebellion, yet one that shaped the very foundations of what we now call Indo-Islamic civilization. The Abbasids came to power in 750 CE after overthrowing the Umayyads in a revolution that spread from Khorasan to the heart of the Islamic Empire. They promised a new kind of rule, one more inclusive, more spiritual, more concerned with justice and knowledge than mere expansion. Their capital shifted from Damascus to Baghdad, and with that, the center of gravity in the Muslim world also shifted eastward, closer to Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian frontier. For Sindh, this change in power far away in the deserts of Arabia meant much more than a new caliph's name on the coins. It meant new administrators, new priorities, and new connections, both cultural and intellectual. When the Abbasids took control, Sindh was already under Muslim rule, but it was far from fully integrated into the vast caliphate. The region was geographically distant and ethnically diverse, a land of Hindus, Buddhists, Arabs, and Persians, a frontier where languages and faiths mingled under the watchful flow of the Indus. The Abbasids inherited it as both an opportunity and a challenge. To govern Sindh was to manage a delicate balance between the Arab settlers who had come with Muhammad bin Qasim, the native Sindhi elites who had adapted to the new order, and the distant central authority in Baghdad that demanded loyalty and taxes. The Abbasids began by consolidating what the Umayyads had left behind. They sent new governors, many of whom were experienced administrators from Khorasan or Iraq. One of the first tasks was to stabilize the region, which had seen revolts and local unrest after Qasim's death. The early governors worked to rebuild alliances with local chiefs, reaffirm trade relations, and ensure that the revenues of Sindh, its grains, textiles, and precious goods, reached the treasury of the caliphate. Yet even as they sought order, the Abbasids understood that this land was not like the others. Sindh was far, and its people followed ancient traditions. So, rather than enforcing rigid control, they introduced a more flexible form of rule. They allowed local systems to function as long as tribute was paid and local customs were respected. This policy created a unique blend of Arab and Sindhi governance. Arabic remained the language of official records, but local dialects and scripts continued in courts and markets. Hindu and Buddhist officials still served under Muslim governors, keeping the economic machine running smoothly. The Abbasids also encouraged migration. Scholars, traders, and Sufi mystics from Persia and Central Asia began to travel eastward, drawn by the new frontier of Sindh. Over time, these men of learning and trade became the bridge between the Islamic world and the Indian subcontinent. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Abbasid influence in Sindh was the emergence of Mansoura, a city that became both the administrative and cultural heart of the region. Located near modern-day Shadadpur, Mansoura was more than a capital. It was a symbol of coexistence. It was planned with wide streets, mosques, markets, and residential quarters, echoing the urban designs of the Islamic world, but rooted in the soil of Sindh. The city's architecture reflected both Arab and local elements. Domes and minarets stood alongside Sindhi brickwork and decorative motifs. From Mansoura, governors managed the affairs of the province, sending reports to Baghdad while overseeing a population that was increasingly diverse and interconnected. Life in Mansoura under Abbasid influence was vibrant and layered. The mosques echoed with the recitation of the Quran, but the markets rang with the voices of Hindu traders, Persian scribes, and local artisans. Paper, still a novelty at the time, began to circulate here, spreading knowledge and ideas. Teachers from Basra and Kufa brought Islamic jurisprudence and theology, while local scholars contributed their understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The blend was subtle but significant, a fusion that would later influence the great centers of learning in Multan, Delhi, and Lahore. Religion, too, took on a gentler, more inclusive tone during the Abbasid era. Unlike the early days of conquest, when Islam had spread through power and politics, the Abbasid period in Sindh saw the rise of Sufi traditions, quiet, introspective, and deeply humane. The seeds of Sufism were sown in this era, carried by travelers and preachers who emphasized love, unity, and spiritual truth over rigid dogma. Their message found fertile ground among the Sindhi people, whose own traditions valued mysticism and devotion. It was during these centuries that the first spiritual foundations were laid for what would become South Asia's great Sufi heritage. But not all was harmony. The Abbasid period in Sindh also saw political turbulence. The distance from Baghdad made it difficult to maintain firm control, and local governors often acted with a degree of independence. Some declared themselves semi-autonomous, paying nominal allegiance to the caliph, but ruling according to their own ambitions. Revolts occasionally flared up, driven by local resentment or competing claims of power. The caliphate, stretched thin across continents, could not always respond quickly. As a result, Sindh became a patchwork of loyalty and rebellion, still tied to the Abbasid world, yet evolving into something distinct. Amid these shifting sands of politics, a quiet transformation continued in society. The Arab settlers who had come generations earlier began to integrate with the local population. Intermarriages became common, creating families that carried both Arab and Sindhi heritage. Arabic words entered the local language, and Sindhi poetry began to reflect themes drawn from Islamic mysticism. The mosques of Mansoura and the surrounding towns became centers not only of worship, but of education and discussion. Travelers passing through Sindh, from Chinese pilgrims to Arab geographers, wrote about its prosperity, its learned men, and its unique blend of cultures. One such traveler was al-Masudi, an Arab historian who visited the region in the 10th century. He described Sindh as a land of wisdom, where people studied philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. He noted that the Muslims of Sindh were different from those in other parts of the caliphate, more open to dialogue, more tolerant of diversity, more intertwined with the traditions of the land. His writings show that by this time, Sindh had moved beyond being a frontier. It had become a meeting place of ideas. Economically, the Abbasid influence brought Sindh into a wider network of trade that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to China. The Indus ports exported indigo, rice, and textiles, while ships brought in horses, spices, and glassware. Baghdad's merchants traded through these routes, enriching both sides. The connection between Sindh and the Abbasid heartland also introduced new technologies, irrigation systems, improved shipbuilding methods, and innovations in agriculture. The land prospered and the wealth of Sindh became known across the region. Yet, even prosperity could not last forever. As the Abbasid Caliphate weakened in the 9th and 10th centuries, its distant provinces began to drift away. In Sindh, local dynasties started to assert their independence. Among them were the Habbarids, descendants of Arab settlers who ruled from Mansoura but gradually adopted local customs and operated as independent kings. They still mentioned the caliph's name in Friday prayers, a symbol of loyalty, but in reality, their rule was autonomous. The Abbasid banner still flew over Sindh, but its meaning had changed. It had become more ceremonial than political. Under the Habbarids, Sindh continued to flourish as a hybrid culture. Arabic and Sindhi inscriptions appeared side by side. Local coins bore Islamic phrases alongside native symbols. The people of Sindh lived at the crossroads of two worlds, the fading Abbasid order and the rising regional powers of India. The cities remained alive with scholars and traders, and Mansoura continued to shine as a beacon of knowledge. But slowly, the ties with Baghdad loosened, and the region began to find its own rhythm. This long and subtle process of change is what makes the Abbasid chapter in Sindh so fascinating and so often forgotten. There were no great wars or dramatic collapses. Instead, there was adaptation, transformation, and quiet endurance. The people of Sindh did not reject the Arab influence, nor did they lose their own identity. They absorbed what came from outside and reshaped it in their own image. Out of this blending came the first roots of what would later define the culture of Pakistan and northern India, a culture that is neither wholly Arab nor entirely Indic, but a fusion of both. When the Abbasid Caliphate finally declined and new powers like the Samanids and Ghaznavids began to rise, Sindh was ready for the next phase of its journey. The influence of Baghdad may have faded, but the legacy of those centuries remained deeply ingrained. The art of calligraphy, the rhythm of poetry, the architecture of mosques, the pattern of trade, all bore the marks of Abbasid thought. Even the spirit of learning, the curiosity that had flourished in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, echoed in the study circles of Mansoura and Multan. It is easy to overlook these quieter chapters of history because they lack the spectacle of battle or conquest. But often it is in these moments, in the spaces between wars, that civilizations truly evolve. The Abbasid period in Sindh teaches us that influence is not always about dominance. Sometimes it is about dialogue. The Caliphate never ruled Sindh with an iron fist, yet its ideas, technologies, and values seeped into the land, leaving a legacy that would last for centuries. When we look at the modern culture of Sindh, its poetry, its music, its spirituality, we can still see echoes of that distant time. The love for learning, the celebration of tolerance, the embrace of both faith and reason, all these trace their roots back to the days when Abbasid scholars, traders, and mystics walked the streets of Mansoura. The forgotten chapter is not really forgotten at all. It lives quietly in the spirit of the region. Think about it for a moment. How many times in history do we focus only on the conquerors and the wars, while the real story, the story of human connection, adaptation, and growth, lies in what happened after the fighting stopped? How many cultures have been shaped not by who ruled them, but by the ideas they absorbed, the wisdom they shared, the peace they built out of difference? If you could walk through the ruins of Mansoura today, if you could stand where the great mosque once stood and feel the dust of centuries between your fingers, would you still hear the faint echoes of prayer and conversation? Would you sense the rhythm of merchants and mystics, of governors and poets blending their voices into a single harmony? And would you realize, perhaps, that this forgotten chapter was not just about Sindh, it was about the human ability to find unity in diversity, to build bridges instead of walls, and to let the flow of the Indus carry ideas as freely as it carries its waters. The Abbasid influence in Sindh may be a forgotten chapter in our textbooks, but in truth, it is one of the most illuminating parts of our shared past. A reminder that history is not only written by swords, but also by minds and hearts that dared to understand one another.